All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, everyone. I'm Ernie Humphrey, the CEO of Treasury Webinars. I would like to thank everyone for taking the time to join us for our webinar today, TE Fraud and Control, Mitigating Internal and External Risk Exposures. I would like to thank our webinar partner today, SAP Concur, whose strong commitment to thought leadership helps us make this webinar possible today. Second to only payroll, T&E spending comprises the largest business expense for companies. T&E is also the second most difficult operating expense to control. T&E expense report processing involves multiple systems, processes, and employees across several departments, in addition to often involving manual tasks. This means that companies face sources of risk relative to T&E spend. In fact, any T&E expense that is out of compliance with a T&E policy is fraudulent. Today, you'll discover how to identify the T&E fraud risk exposures faced by your company and learn how to leverage technology in conjunction with employee education and an effective T&E policy to mitigate T&E fraud at your company. Before I delve into the content, I'm going to offer a few quick words about Treasury Webinars, cover a few housekeeping items, and then I'm going to review our learning objectives as they represent our value proposition to you for investing an hour of your valuable time to attend our webinar today. Treasury Webinars offers webinars designed to empower Treasury, accounts payable, and accounts receivable success at companies of all sizes across all industries. We only do what we do best, webinars. Now for the exciting housekeeping items. For those of you interested in receiving CTP credit for attending today's webinar, you need to answer all of our polling questions and remain on for the duration of the webinar. If you have any questions regarding CTP credit, please send me an email to ernie@treasurywebinars.com. I have also included my email address in the questions area of your GoToWebinar control panel. Speaking of your GoToWebinar control panel, I'd love to hear from you throughout the webinar today with your questions. If you have any questions, you can ask them at any time in the questions area of your GoToWebinar control panel. I'll do my best to get to all of your questions during the Q&A session at the tail end of the webinar. Fear not, if I do not get to your question, I will follow up with you directly after the webinar. Finally, we appreciate your consideration in taking a short survey at the end of our webinar today, as we always strive to improve the ROI we offer our attendees for their valuable time. Now, what are our learning objectives today? After the webinar today, I'd like you to be able to identify specific opportunities to improve the structure of your company's T&E policy. I'd like you to be able to identify specific opportunities to improve compliance with your company's T&E policy. What I mentioned before was that any expense that is out of compliance with your policy is fraudulent spend. So this is a place where I think companies can do well, some low-hanging fruit with the right technology and process. And from what I've seen in the market, companies of all sizes face out of compliance expenses. So we'll talk about how to get the right policy in place, and just as importantly, how to enforce that policy. And then we also want you to be able to identify existing and emerging T&E fraud exposures at your company. And then we'd like you to be able to leverage technology in alignment with employee education and process to mitigate T&E fraud exposures at your companies. So how are we going to accomplish our objectives today? Well, first, we're going to start things out with a little why T&E expense management matters, because after this webinar today, I'm sure you're going to be motivated to go to your CFO and tell them that we need to really take a look at T&E expense fraud mitigation. So we want to make sure that they understand the importance of T&E. I found that oftentimes when I talk to CFOs and when I do presentations, I find that they really don't have a very good understanding of the amount of spend and the investment that's being made in the area of T&E. So we want to give you a little ammunition there. And then we'll talk about T&E expense control. So we'll talk about visibility, policy, and education. So I always say you can't manage what you can't see, and you certainly can't manage the risk associated with something if you don't have visibility into the area that you're trying to mitigate that risk. And then we'll dive deeper into T&E fraud mitigation. We'll share some great key insights from some thought leadership resources from our webinar partner, SAP Concur, some common schemes, and some ways, some specific actions that you can take to mitigate those fraud risk exposures. And then we'll wrap things up with some closing thoughts in our Q&A. Again, I would love your questions, so please take this opportunity to ask questions throughout the webinar. So why does T&E expense matter? Well, just some quick statistics. What we've seen is there is a trend in the annual growth rate of T&E spend. So the numbers aren't really important. To me, what matters is the annual growth rate. So just from 2016 to 17, we saw a 13% growth, annual growth rate. I think that growth rate was actually, if not higher, consistent with that. And so that's not going to change. So what we've seen in the general economy is a shift to that subscription economy. And what does this mean? It means companies, you need to earn the business of your clients continually throughout the year. So it's not the case where you just have a client, you sell them a big ticket item and there's no customer support. The subscription economy means you have to continually earn that business. And also, I'm glad to see companies are investing more in that human capital. So they're investing in their companies, traveling, having company meetings, engaging their employees, like when they're centralizing activities, they're investing in employee professional development. So I don't think that's going to change. And the other reason that it's tremendously important, and I think this is a fact I always bring up, is T&E ranks as the second most difficult operating expense category to control. So it's the same way with accounts payable. When you look at the complexity of accounts payable and T&E, they're really oftentimes the most complex business processes company has, but there's not much investment paid in the efficiency of their process. On the technology front, oftentimes when companies start to look at technology, it's their first instinct is, hey, we want to start our technology transformation in accounts payable and T&E. But what I've found is that's actually the place that has a lot of low-hanging fruit and impact. So I mentioned earlier that you can't manage what you can't see. So let's start things out with a little polling question, so we can add a little color around my content when I talk about visibility, and I can see where everyone's at, so I can know how much attention I need to focus here. So I'm asking you to share with me how you would characterize the visibility at your company. Is it excellent, almost real time? Is it good, not bad, could be better? Is it poor, or is it really your opinion that it really doesn't exist? Don't worry, I'm not going to share the results with your boss if you answer non-existent. Also want to take a few moments to remind everyone that I appreciate your consideration in answering all of our polling questions here today. Those of you who are interested in receiving CTP credits for today's webinar, you will have to answer all of our polling questions today. So I'm going to go ahead and leave the polling question up for another few seconds. So I'm giving you the 5-second warning here, and then I'll go ahead. We'll close the poll, we'll share the results, and then we'll start to dig into the importance of T&E expense visibility and what the value that brings to us in mitigating our T&E related risk exposures. Let's go ahead and close the polling question. Let's go ahead and take a quick peek at those results. So I'm encouraged to see that we've got 59% of you good and excellent. Those of you at excellent, almost real-time visibility, that's fantastic. I think that should be our goal. And with the solutions that are out there today in terms of T&E expense, automation, the tools themselves, and also their integrability with ERP systems and other business systems, I think companies of all sizes will find that they're investing in automation in the area of T&E is really, really solid in terms of the ROI. So we'd like to see more folks going to that excellent. And so 30% not bad. So hopefully those of you at not bad and poor will really show you some of the consequences that can have for your company in terms of the risk exposures that you face, because it's very important to have that visibility. So it's almost like you don't know what you don't know, right? And so when you're creating the business case for investing in technology, the risk mitigation is probably going to be a part of that. So you need to be able to communicate the urgency, and especially with the manual tasks that we often see, and even the way payments are made, it'll really make your business case compelling and give you a few scare tactics for the risk exposures that you can share to get people's attention. So T&E visibility, let's just take a few moments here. So again, I said you can't manage what you can't see. And what I always tell people in terms of when we're looking at risk mitigation in T&E, let's also look at the process efficiency, because really when we're going to want to make that business case, that we need more resources. Let's make that business case more robust. So let's not just look at risk mitigation, which is absolutely critical, but let's start to look at how we improve costs and impact productivity as well of the folks involved in the T&E process. So I strongly advise people to know. I think it's critical that you know how much it costs your company to process an expense report. So as you start to see that cost, you start to see the inefficiencies. And also what this does is it makes you map out your T&E process end to end. So if you have not done this or you don't know if your team has done this, I would strongly encourage you to map out the process from start to finish. And what I like to do is when I break it down and say keep it simple, let's look at the people involved, the process involved, and the technology involved. And what we'll talk about a little bit later, that's how you can frame your risk exposures, right? You look at the people involved. So what are the risks with the people involved, whether that's internal people, external people? What are the risks involved with our processes? Do we have manual processes? Do we have data key entry? So what are some of the things? And then technology. What technology are we leveraging? Do we have Excel reports that can be manipulated? Are we letting people enter bank account information? How can that be manipulated? Maybe that's in our ERP system. Maybe it's a combination of both. Do we have a supplier portal? So let's look at those. So I believe the companies need a system that gives you visibility into T&E spend. So I think it's very important to help you manage the cost of processing the reports, but also for companies to start taking more of a analytical view of how they're spending their T&E. So I think what we're going to start to see in the research side is let's start to look at the ROI of T&E spend. So it's not necessarily that companies want to spend less, they want to spend in the right areas. And of course, from a risk mitigation perspective, we want to be sure that we are spending in compliance with our policy. And we'll talk about this later. So you might find that it might be alarming to you when you find out that there's a large dollar amount in terms of your non-compliant expenses. Well, that could be the case that your policy needs work. So it could be things that your salespeople need to do that align with industry. So it's not necessarily a bad thing, but it's certainly a red flag and certainly needs attention. And then I believe you need a system that allows your company to deliver expense reporting to your travelers, to your managers, and your company leaders to benchmark and actively manage that T&E spend. So again, I think it's important that we'll talk about this more. We educate our travelers so we can see what they're spending. For our managers, we often look to our managers in order to review things, whether or not they're in policy compliance. Now, if you think about it, that's a pretty heavy lift for a manager to expect them to understand all the category limits off the top of their heads, right? And so we need to make sure we optimize that travel IQ with our travelers and managers. And we can do that a lot automatically with a T&E solution. We'll talk about that later. But we want to make sure that T&E is on the radar, right, of our company leaders, and they see the importance of it. And again, understand the risks that are involved. And again, the importance of having that policy and getting it right, and then making sure that we optimize that ROI, right? That ROI is tremendously important, right? For many companies, it's your second largest operating expense. For companies, even tens, $20 million, that can be several $100,000. In enterprise-sized companies, that's $1 million, $2 million, right? When you look at the spend, but then let's also look at the cost to process all that spend. So you look at that number, you start to take 20, 30, 40, 50% off there, right? And you've got maybe hundreds of thousands of dollars, if not millions of dollars, going off the bottom line. I guarantee your CFO is going to get a big smile on his face if you can tell him by investing in technology, we can mitigate fraud, win, impact the bottom line, win-win, improve our internal controls. If we can really understand and effectively manage the risk for T&E, second most difficult operating expense, we can certainly leverage that across the enterprise and take that right to accounts payable as well. So let's look at harmonizing our risk management efforts across the enterprise. And when we look at risk mitigation, let's look at accounts payable too, and let's dig into that as well and look at those payment risks that we have as well. So let's pivot a little bit before we start talking about T&E policy. Let's get a little benchmark here of our audience. Just curious if you have a formal T&E policy. So obviously it's an easy one, right? Yes or no, or you don't know. So some of the research that I've seen over the past, I'd say 3 or 4 years, I've been really involved in the T&E space. I've seen some numbers that were surprising to me. So that's really the first step. And when we start digging in, we'll talk about how it's important. Even if you have that policy, you need to make sure that you review that policy and review that policy with your travelers and give them the ability to influence that policy, right? I think that's important, and make sure that we're not, it's kind of like the Goldilocks and the Three Bears, right? It's we got to have enough control, but we don't want to make it so restrictive that we're not allowing our employees to deliver value, especially our sales professionals. So we'll talk about that. So again, I appreciate everyone's consideration in answering our polling question. So let me go ahead and give you a couple more seconds, then let's go ahead and take a quick look at the results here. So let's take a quick look here. So good. I am absolutely very impressed. So that's awesome. So 88% say yes. So that's good. And I'll give you a follow-up polling question here along how often that's reviewed, and that's the first step. And so 7% of you know, and 5% of you don't know. Your takeaway for the webinar is we need to, and those of you that don't know, I think it'd be a great idea if you find out. And those of you that are know, we would be happy to help you formulate that policy and point you to those resources, because that is critically important, right? You don't know what you don't know. So if you don't have a policy in place, you don't know where you're at benchmarking, how much money is being fraudulently spent or really spent at all, and what's that ROI. So you really have, it's really the cornerstone of controlling that T&E spend. So thank you very much, everyone, for answering those questions for me. So let's look at that policy. So this is, I think, is the foundation of expense control. Again, if you're out of compliance, that's T&E fraud. So how do we mitigate that? How do we align our policy with our spend? So you need a formal policy. You need an enforceable policy. So some of these things seem like common sense, but believe me, I've seen many policies, and sometimes those of you that have been at your companies and you've never seen your policy, maybe you're the CFO and you never really look at it, and you start to look at it, and then you're like, okay, well, we need to look at this, right? If it's not your practice to look at it every 6 months or every year, you need an enforceable policy. So it has to be something that you can enforce, and it also has to be an education, right, on your employee side, so that if you don't comply with this policy, there are going to be consequences. So let's say, for the sake of argument, we have reporting. John's a manager. His area has $200,000 a year out of policy compliance. You know, that should be like a, whoa, he should be really, you know, if John isn't concerned about that and there's no consequences to that, well, I think that's a big problem. But it has to be enforceable, and it has to be a little bit flexible in that the business conditions are going to change, right? So if your company goes out and makes an acquisition, goes into a new market, those dollar amounts may need to change. So that's a good reason to have that policy review. And one of the other parts of education that I'll talk about a little bit later is that I think it's important for companies to have resources relative to their policy online, so folks have access to them and access to that mobilely. So having the policy itself and having some frequently asked questions, and also potentially having someone that's that focal point, right? So if you have a question that's during business hours, right? Let's give someone a way to call on the phone, or they can submit a question, right? Maybe someone's checking those emails. And so the more you can arm what you want to do is, obviously you want to stop fraudulent spend before it starts. You want to stop inefficient spend before it gets out the door, right? Again, the policy needs to be enforced, and a policy that is known and understood by business travelers. So I call that the travel policy IQ. So we want to make sure that it's understood by our business travelers. So in general, if folks understand the policy, understand the consequences, then that's going to mitigate a lot of out of policy expense. So when you're looking at your policy itself, you want to look at, okay, responsibility, who's got the responsibility for the policy, enforcing the policy, reviewing the spend, right? Whether it's the managers or that second level of spend once it gets into accounting or your T&E department. authorization, right? Who's authorizing that spend? Okay, the manager might be reviewing it, authorizing it, and then before it goes out the door, do we have treasury professionals if it's above a certain dollar amount or it's a batch? And then what are the permissions that folks have? So how much can your manager approve? What's the right level before it needs to go up to have a more formal approval? So let's take a little bit of a deeper dive into the best practices. So I think this is good, even if you have a policy. These are things that you might want to review. Again, if you're not in control of the policy. And then some of the slides that I have in here, if you're not directly involved in the T&E policy, you're not directly involved with managing the T&E per se, you might be accounts payable controller. These are good slides to possibly review with your team, and then probably help you if you're going to have a meeting to review that policy. So you got to make sure that they're aligned with your company's culture and budgetary goals. So again, we're past budgeting time, right? We're right into Q1, pretty hard in there, but we need to make sure that our policy allows us enough flexibility to meet our goals. And then we have to align with our company's corporate culture. And I think we're starting to see more investment in that, and I'm glad to see that, because I think that had gone by the wayside. Probably in about the mid 90s is when I saw that to go down a little bit. But the culture that we always tried to have and what we strove for, and it was that way just because of how tight our policy was and the compliance, the review was that spend money like it's your own, right? I mean, that's in T&E, that's the goal. So in order to do that, you have to educate folks, right? This is why we have the policy the way it is. This is the reason that we need to do this. This is the benchmarks, so it's important to do that. It's got to meet all the rules. If you don't have a plan, I just have a hyperlink in here. If you want the presentation, please send me an email. An accountable plan. It's the IRS. So if you need more information on that or want more resources and maybe some templates and things, and maybe want to be connected with folks that have recently gone through this, please let me know. There's a lot of great thought leadership pieces out there on T&E policy construction. And then best practice is to automate. I believe to automate enforcement with clearly defined spending limits and automatic notification of policy violations to ensure compliance. So many of the T&E expense management solutions out there will actually allow you to program some of your policy limits out there. So it can be a hard or a soft stop. So it can be the case where someone puts in an expense and it's over the limit. So let's say you're going out to dinner with someone. The policy limit is $50 a person. It's $100, the total bill. You submit that. Oh, what happens, right? Oh, it can stop immediately and say, I'm not going to process this. Or what you can do is say, oh, I can let it through, but if there's going to be sent, or it can send a warning and say, this is out of policy compliance. This email is going to go to your manager letting him know, right? So you can have that hard or soft stop, or you can have that, you can do that. But I think automating that policy enforcement is really key in order that really facilitates that compliance with your policy. Again, you need to make sure that your policy is constructed the right way and that your folks are educated. But I think that can be a key tool, and that's a big benefit in terms of the T&E solutions, in terms of that risk management, in terms of compliance with policy and T&E spend. So, again, part of this education with your employees, you want to have a clear and parent approval process. And then I think it's good that we review with people, okay, this is the timing of when these decisions need to be made and the turnaround times for expense reimbursement. And that visibility and reporting from T&E expense management solutions allows us to track, right? Let's see if there's any hiccups in our workflow, bottlenecks in our workflow. What we want to do is we want to say, okay, from the time the expense report is input into the system, how long does it take our travelers to get their money back, right? It's a good way to put a smile on the sales guy's face is to reduce the time, right, that it takes to reimburse them for their expense report. So you want to encourage managers not to let these things pile up for weeks and weeks. And part of that is giving them access to a solution that gives them the ability to review and approve on the road. So one of the things, a risk risk source is if you don't have if you have a very manual system, if your manager is going through a pile of 100 expense reports, what are the odds that he's going to pay the time that he needs to do that? So that really increases your risk of fraudulent spend in that part of the approval process. And then what we're seeing a lot, there's a lot of integrated travel into the T&E apps, and I think this is important to have in your travel policy. Specify how travel is to be booked, whether specific travel agents or online booking tools. Now, we all think our employees are bright. Do we want all of our employees out there on Priceline, right? Do we really trust all of our employees to take the time to plan far enough ahead? So some of the value that we're seeing in expense management solutions is actually these integrated travel features, which is probably another whole webinar, and we'll talk about that later on this year in our webinars related to T&E expense management. But what you're really doing there is you're taking away the opportunity for that fraudulent spend, right? So you're putting a process in where that spend has to be approved before it gets out the door. So that's incredibly important. Technology also helps mitigate things like duplicate expenses in terms of airline tickets as well, and helps track and make sure we're using those unused tickets and folks aren't taking advantage of us on that. And then we should establish how payments are to be made for eligible reimbursement. So do we want to have folks use a T&E card or not? That can help us on many ways, especially on the accounting side. And a lot of times our T&E expense management solutions will actually take a feed in, and you can assign the GO codes there. And then with some of the T&E cards, you can actually restrict spend based on merchant category codes, MCC codes. So that's can be tremendously valuable as well. And then when you're going to invest in these manual audits, and there are solutions out there that automate audits of all your expenses with artificial intelligence. So that's something that you might want to take a look at as well. You want to audit with purpose. Is it budget management, fraud loss prevention, or auditing to test specific controls and processes? So even if you don't go the step of using a solution that uses artificial intelligence to recognize patterns, you can actually see these things with your reporting. So you can see by department, right? Or there's certain trends. John, let's take a look at John. Maybe we audit a group of individuals, and let's just look at John and say John's expenses have been going up or down. John goes to this same conference every year. So you can look at those trends. And the good news is when you leverage a T&E expense automation solution, you give your staff time, right, to do these things that are analytical, that offer value and aren't non-value add activities like being on the phone, talking back and forth with folks about maybe the GO code's wrong. Maybe they're out of compliance. Well, maybe they're out of compliance because they didn't know any better. Maybe we could have automatically put that GO code into that mobile solution when we were scanning in their receipts. Maybe we could have put that GNL code in there as part of the feed that comes in from the corporate credit card expenses. So there's an awful lot that can be done. And then as we start to automate compliance with our policy, what we're doing at the same time as we're mitigating risk, right? If you think about it, what I've been talking about, we're potentially pulling people out of the process. We're removing manual processes. We are automating, streamlining process flow. We're creating an audit trail, right, for that process flow. And then the other thing that we are doing is we are giving, again, that audit trail that we have for that flow. And we're also optimizing the technology and systems that we have. So that's important. And there's a few things that I see that are often missed. Outline exceptions under which exceptions can occur to policy, and then create an audit trail for any exceptions granted travelers. One thing that I'll note here, which is obvious, I hear at conferences all the time, I have a hard time enforcing the T&E policy to my CXOs. Well, that's just too bad. You have to be able to do that. So they need to understand that. And in automating policy compliance, that's one way that you can do this. Some companies actually have a separate set of rules for executives, and I guess I understand that, but I would still, they need to be held into compliance with your policies. And then again, you want to integrate travel process expense reporting to facilitate compliance and create efficiencies by streamlining process. Again, integrating the travel expense processing using some of these integrated travel features can be extremely valuable. And then you want to benchmark key areas of spend and require a review of policy if benchmarks are exceeded by a target percentage. So what you can do is you're preparing maybe for your annual review, semi-annual review. Again, you need that visibility in your expenses. You want to see, okay, where are we at year over year? Where are we at in terms of industry that we're in or areas that we're trying to do business development? There are actually studies out there, I'm happy to say, much more information on benchmarking T&E spend the last couple of years. And then this keeps your policy from becoming outdated and keeps the attention focused on your spending T&E trends. So let's go ahead and break things up a little bit. Let's go ahead and ask a polling question I've been hinting at here for the last 5 or 10 minutes or so, asking you to share with me how often your company reviews your T&E policy with your employee. So once a year, less than once a year. One of my past employers, we only did this when we were hired. Maybe it's not relevant because you have no formal policy or you don't know. I want to remind everyone that I can still take your questions at any time in the questions area of your GoToWebinar control panel. I want to thank everyone for taking the time to answer all of our polling questions here today. And I also want to remind those of you who are interested in receiving CTP credit that you'll need to answer all of our polling questions here today. So I'm going to go ahead and leave the polling question up for another few seconds. And then we're going to talk about how the tools that we can use in driving your T&E policy compliance. Once you make sure you have that policy in place, it's reviewed, has the right input from everyone. So let's go ahead and close that polling question. Take a quick peek. Glad to see 43% of you at least once a year. I was at a AP P2P conference last year, and I was happy to see that number was even higher, so I'm glad to see that. 18% less than once a year, and 19% only employees when hired. So we've got, probably almost 60% that I would encourage. The 18%, I would encourage you consider doing this more than at least once a year, if not more. And then only with employees when hired. I think that's just a little bit dangerous. So what we had to do is we had to sign a yellow sheet, and I'm not sure that I really understood the yellow sheet. So one thing that I would encourage folks to do, if that's really what you have to do, I would make them take a quiz, right? And make sure that they can answer the questions. And I would encourage folks when you're reviewing your policy compliance with folks that they all have to pass that quiz, have that IQ quiz. And those of you that don't know, I would encourage you to find out and see what's happening and why it's not happening. And so again, there's just a lot of room for improvement here, and there's a lot of out of policy compliance mitigation, and again, also mitigating just better control and lowering your processing costs to making that investment. So thank you very much, everyone, for taking the time to answer that polling question. So let's go ahead, and I know we've talked about these things, but let's just get them all in one place and add a little color commentary. And these are a slide you might want to print out. So we talked about technology, how to drive that compliance. You can really leverage solutions out there to automate compliance and also create that audit trail. So again, you can have what I call these hard stops, automatically stops, or some soft stops. You can actually program in some exceptions where they go. But when you're making those exceptions to workflow, we want to make sure that we're automating those as well. So the other part, again, technology helps remove manual tasks from the system, helps remove people from the system, right? As you remove people that have opportunity to create fraud, it's going to lower your fraud. Because if there's opportunities for fraud that exist and there's no checks and balances on them, it's going to happen. Education, I've talked about this quite a bit. Obviously, something that I like to get on my soapbox about, just because I see this as a relatively low-cost way to ensure that policy compliance. Some of the specific things I would recommend is one would just be to have a lunch, of course, the webinar, right? Like I'm doing today. You can do a webinar recording, make sure everyone has to attend the webinar recording. If your sales team is coming in the office, right? Let's give them food. They love food. So let's have that formal presentation to them. And then not only the travelers, but the managers as well. And then also all those that are involved in processing T&E expense reports. So one of the things we do there is the people, they need to make sure that we know we're watching them, right? So they need to know that there's a clear audit trail. We're watching them, and so they're educated. And they're also educated into areas where fraud can be introduced. So just, teach them not to just push a button, right, when they don't need to, right? Let's look at the detail. Let's look at things, and then let's be a little more analytical. And they can do that as we give them their time back by removing these non-value add tasks. Sometimes we can have some monetary incentives. So, hey, John, your department was under 5%. So you had 95% compliance. You get a bonus, or it could be joint, right? The whole company, right? If our compliance goes under this, we'll all get a $500 bonus. That'll work. Then we have some, gamification going on. Play folks off each other, and then we can have penalties, right? So let's have managers. If your out of compliance T&E spend is over 10%, over 20%. Guess what? That's going to cost you $1,000 from your bonus. That'll get people to pay attention. So you can get creative there. So these are all ways that we can drive that compliance. So now let's dive a little bit into the fraud itself, right? And just a little bit more outside of the compliance, which obviously I feel is very important with your T&E policy. So this is a cool graphic, I think, from the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners, just to kind of look at where this T&E spend flows. So we have the fraud and abuse, we have asset misappropriation, our fraudulent distributions here, right? We have expense reimbursement schemes, but as I mentioned earlier, when we start to look at risk management, hopefully when we're looking at T&E, we're looking at AP as well, right? Billing schemes, payroll schemes, check and payment tampering, register disbursements. So we want to look at, obviously, understand T&E and do that. But again, as we're investing time and resources into risk management, let's see that we have great benefit here. But let's get with AP if we don't own AP and T&E, and let's look at all these things, and let's look at educating our AP team in the same way, right? What is the process from A to Z? What are the risk exposures? So there's really 4 types of expense fraud schemes. And again, this is good information to just share with those, right? Your managers who are reviewing it, and just kind of put things on their radar as well. And these are things that are good to review when you're reviewing that T&E policy as well. So just to get attention, right? $31,000 is the median loss amount to expense reimbursement fraud. 2 years to detect expense reimbursement fraud. So you think about how much can go on in that time. But the good news is with technology, we can really detect this fraud much more quickly. Again, whether we're automating the audit in some way or doing 100% audit with some sort of automation, and then 17% of all fraud are expense reimbursement schemes. So this is something that definitely deserves our attention. So I found a great resource, which is one of our sponsors, SAP Concur, taking the driver's seat in a fraud and ebook. I think it's great. So I've got a hyperlink there, and I've got a link to it later on. So I encourage you to take a look at that. It's really interesting. So I love research. I love data, but the way this is presented is really interesting to me. So interesting, kind of the face of fraud. 55% is committed by 31 to 45-year-olds. I have to admit that I'm older than that now, so maybe I fall out of that. But just interesting to see 51% have a university degree or higher. So it's so it's an incentive, right? So they're figuring out ways to game the system. So so to sit there and think, hey, I'm smarter than the people that are creating fraud within my company. Well, this should aware to the fact that that may not be the case. 10% of travelers generate the majority of fraud. So of course, we get this, it's just a few bad apples, right? But so we need to really look at those trends, right? We need to look at where is the majority of that spend coming from, over time, if you're not going to do extensive audits by employee, it's good to random sample and make sure that everyone is looked at in a certain amount of time. And then I hate to say this for my accounting friends out there, but most fraud is committed by the accounting department. So knowing that, we want to make sure that we've got that audit trail in place and that we've got a separation of duties, right? And that separation of duties, we'll want to make sure that that entire process and approval process does not go through the accounting department. Now, that may be a little bit difficult given the size of your company, but just look at that right there. Should get your attention. So these are just some interesting facts, and these are fun things to talk about when you're talking with your travelers and maybe your CXOs about fraud. So just to give a little color here, and then we'll dive a little deeper into some specific schemes that we have. We got mischaracterized. That's disguising personal expenses, trying to make them look as if they're business expenses. This happens quite often from my experience when folks go to conferences. Overstatement of actual expenses. So people will alter receipts. So they'll alter receipts given the technology out there. They'll add on there fictitious expenses. People will have counterfeit receipts, and then multiple reimbursement, submitting duplicate reports. And sometimes this can be done inadvertently, but it's still a type of fraud if it occurs. So some common T&E fraud schemes, again, got this information from the resource I mentioned earlier. The profitable per diems, right? So I know it's easier for folks to get a per diem, but you need to make sure that that makes sense, right? It's human nature, as honest as we all are. If you want to set a per diem and it's going to be something that you think about where people are going, right? So you might have different per diems where people are traveling, and that makes sense. But if you have a flat number for everyone, so it makes sense, right? If someone's going to New York City, right? But I live in Indiana, right? So if I go to Indiana, I go to a restaurant and I can get a good dinner for $20 and my per diem's $100. Well, that $80, that's going in my pocket. And for me, that's just the way it is, right? That's a source of income for me. And it's not that I'm trying to cheat the system. It's just that the per diem, is not there. So I would say, I don't know. I would say that's some of that is due to the company limits and not paying enough attention to align those across different demographics. Mileage padding. So, folks that are traveling, the good news is that some of the providers out there, they have a kind of a link to Google Maps. And so what you can do is you can make it so that when someone goes, say I go to Chicago to Indianapolis, you use Google Maps and it'll tell you the exact mileage, so we can really mitigate mileage padding. And I've seen companies where just eliminating that mileage padding has been tens, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars. Of course, we talked about just these fake expenses, just making things up for conference, especially maybe at conferences they're going, maybe training that they said they attended online, or maybe you give them professional development, but to bucket unused airline tickets. So there are folks to game the system on that, and these last minute flight bookings. So those two, we can really mitigate those using some of the integrated travel schemes. But again, these just give us areas to look at, right? Let's look at the mileage, right? If we don't have automated mileage tracking, let's just take a look. Sample, right? Who drives a lot? Okay, let's just start to look at the miles. And then this can be something where someone is just guessing, right? But then you have to educate your folks. Okay, John, let's get you to use Google Maps, right? Or let's use Pandora, but let's make sure that we do that, right? And so it can be education, right? And then double dipping, right, is where people try and get reimbursed for the same expense. And then we've got schemes that work across different financial systems. So people take advantage of that workflow and say information is flowing from one system to another, right? Maybe there's no audit trail there. So maybe we have one system. Oops, it comes out for manual input. Guess what happens? Someone changes that information. Oops, someone changes that banking information. So you want to look at that workflow, and you want to, again, spend the time going A to Z on that workflow. What are all the places? So it's like those Sarbanes-Oxley diagrams that we all love to look at. So it's like, where is that risk exposure? What is there? Is there a way to automate and track that so we can remove that? So this is just an interesting thing to look at, give you some information to share with your folks who are looking at these, approving these, and then who may be auditing these, whether it's managers auditing their own people, your internal audit team, maybe you have an external auditor come in and do an extensive audit of your expenses for you. So I talked about this, so I like to keep it simple. And so for me, you want to look at your fraud exposures, people, process, technology. So you look at the people, right? There's incentives. Those are the 4 types of expenses. The processes, right? You want to make sure you have effective controls and oversight in identifying the out of policy expenses. And then in terms of technology, we can possibly have ineffective or only manual audits and controls. So when we can align those all, people, process, and technology, to mitigate the processing costs, mitigate the time to process that invoice, that is going to be helpful in mitigating those fraud exposures. But if you want to characterize those, again, a good way to look at it is people, process, technology, looking at that process in detail from A to Z. So let's take a look at, why do I think, or why do we think that companies fail in their attempts to manage T&E fraud? Well, most companies only audit 1 to 15% of expense reports, and many still do it manually. So, right? So when you start to look at that, it makes sense in some sense to do some targeted audits, but again, you want to look at ways to do this automated. And again, there are solutions that do it automatically. Some people ask, do companies do 100%? Of course, that depends on your company size, your risk tolerance. I think it may be something to consider doing every so many years. But again, if you really want to take that, if you're really risk averse and you have concerns, and maybe you've just acquired a company that's almost as big as yours, and you're not comfortable, with their T&E control. So I will give you a personal example of this. When I was a treasury manager, when we bought a company, I looked at every single expense that went out the door for 6 months. And so I looked at every single expense, and that was my way of educating them into our policy controls. And then we automated that a bit, but that's just something, that you might do. So maybe it's something as maybe you take a business division, right, where you see there might be fraud exposures, and do that 100% audit. But again, there's technology out there that allows you to automate all of those. And then good news is almost all of you have that policy. That's why that's a big obstacle. Lack of effective employee training. Again, I mentioned that T&E policy IQ. So if the employees don't know what the policy is, the managers don't know what the policy is, well, then that's going to really, really cause that out of policy. And then if they're too vague or out of line with relevant benchmarks, again, that's going to make us have out of policy compliance, but also increase our T&E spend overall. And then if your T&E enforcement is lax or non-existent. So again, if there are no consequences there, and then the opportunities for fraud exist. So again, we have manual processes, we have disjointed systems, we don't have audit trails, we're not automating things. So opportunities for fraud exists. And sometimes, you might want to take a couple people and then just ask, have them, we have some systems where sometimes people try and hack into your system, and it might be something where you might test your controls, right? Maybe take some folks and test those controls, or ask folks, hey, this is our flow. This is our measures. What do you think? Where do you think there's places that we need to look at? So let's take some people maybe outside of finance and have them get their input on that. So I'm going to go ahead and offer a few closing thoughts. Then we have time for a few questions. So these are sometimes when I go to webinars myself, I leave and I'm just like, okay, that was kind of interesting, but what can I do, right? Where do I start? So I always try and give people, these are some specific things that you can do, and these are your takeaways, and these are ways to impact your value to your employer. So I talked about this. Educate all your employees to optimize your travel policy IQ. Again, I see a lot of companies doing it once a year, and I would say it kind of depends on your business as well, but I would say every 6 months or every year is good. And then along those lines, let's make sure that we have resources available, right, to our managers and travelers. Let's get that policy online or on your internal network. Let's get those FAQs up. Let's give people the resources and incentive to optimize that travel IQ. You need that visibility into the T&E processes and spend. Again, we talked about that at length, but giving us ability to see where there's trends that we might want to look at and areas in the process we can improve. And so that helps us on all levels, lower the cost, mitigate risk as well. You want to look to automate key components of T&E expense management. Again, removing manual processes, removing people from the system, things that we can do, direct feeds, credit card, autofill, parsing technology, some of the OCR technology, automated approval workflows, and take measures to improve the enforcement of your policies. I talked about want to automate compliance. And then we just want to leverage analytics to improve intelligence and data. So let's get some reporting that we can give to our managers, to our CXOs, and let's really start to look at those trends in our data. What are we spending? Why are we spending? How much does it cost? Right? And then let's start to look at the ROI of our spending as well. Before I open the Q&A, just real quickly, a few resources that I've leveraged today, which I really think are really good resources. We took some great statistics out of there, taking the driver's seat, a fraud T&E book. Again, I've got the hyperlink there. If you want that, please send me an email and we'll get that to you. And then let's go ahead and kick off our Q&A. So I'll try and bundle some of the questions that I have here together. So the first question is really around making the business case for the investment in time and resources. So I've got a couple of people, right, asking questions and saying, this really makes sense to me, but how do I get those resources allocated? So two things. One is just take some of the key components of the presentation, take some slides, talk about the risk exposures, but I think it really helps to frame this as overall, right, effective T&E expense management. And fraud is a key piece of that. So take this fraud piece and package that with, okay, what's the value to us in investing in automation and looking at our T&E processes? So let's look at all the folks involved. So let's look at our, T&E folks and our risk management folks if they're not the same people. And so let's take a look at the business case for that, right? Investing in technology. One, I told you many ways it can help mitigate fraud, right? We need to do that. Lowers invoice processing costs. We talked about that. We improve that compliance. And then it also impacts our productivity, right? We talked about that. So we're eliminating these manual processes and we're allowing people to spend more time on value add activities, which also includes proactively looking at trends that we might have in terms of T&E risk exposures. So a couple questions around the reviewing the policy. So just a few points there. I think it's important that when we're going to review the policies, we are open to input from our travelers. So so we want to have that input so we can say that we're reviewing our policy. So let's ask our travelers, is there anything in this policy that you would change and why? Right? Your most frequent travelers are going to be your sales team. So I would have this integrated into some of the sales training that you do. But let's make sure, because if people are involved in the policy, they're going to be invested in it, right? They're going to know it. They're going to be invested in it. And so let's make sure that we're looking at that. And let's also explain to them how we're coming up with our policy, how we're benchmarking it, or ask for their suggestions. Is there anything in here that we can improve? Are there things that you guys are going to need to do? Is there something changing in our sales tactics, right? And then I mentioned this before. People are also, again, just getting back to a few questions on the value proposition and risk management. So I think what we want to do is we want to really strive for T&E fraud to fit in with your overall fraud mitigation programs. And the logical place to start is with your accounts payable. And so that's another webinar, right? So we can I look at T&E as internal accounts payable, and then supplier payments as external accounts payable. So we can use so we can use some of these tactics and controls across the board. So again, as we look at the benefit here, let's see how that benefit has synergies, right? I mean, within AP, maybe to AP, right? So let's make that business case together. And so just kind of one more question about some resources. There are several resources out there that I've seen, so you can get some of those doing some general Google searches. And sometimes you can get those resources if you're looking at specific solution providers. You can provide those. They can provide those to you if you have specific statistics you're looking for. Feel free to email those to me, and I'll see what I can do about connecting you with that information. And then the other thing I would suggest is that you connect with your fellow folks that are facing the same challenges as you are. Again, your title may be different. If you're a big company, you might be the CFO, you might have ownership of this, you might be a controller, but going on LinkedIn and doing a search, and you can find that there's groups on accounts payable and T&E, or going to conferences. So connecting with people in the industries. I mean, T&E is not and shouldn't really be a competitive advantage. The technology levels the playing field, but just talk to people that have faced your same challenges. They probably have statistics they should be willing to share with you, and don't be afraid to ask. It's most of the time people are very happy that you're looking at them for their expertise. So I would suggest that you go onto LinkedIn. There's some associations I can point you to. You can do general Google searches, but the amount of information out there is absolutely incredible now, and so it's good that we have the information out there. So let me go ahead and launch final polling question for everyone as I wrap things up with a few closing comments. So again, T&E is just an incredibly important area, and risk mitigation is absolutely essential in this area. And then I think we need to look at this in the framework of out of policy spend is fraud. So how do we mitigate that fraud? And then let's keep it simple, right? Let's look at people, process, technology. Let's look at those risk exposures, and let's look at technology, people, and process, and let's see, and that policy compliance. And I think it's really, really easy to some low-hanging fruit there in terms of mitigating those risks. And in mitigating those risks, you're also, if you're leveraging technology, you're going to lower processing costs, and you're going to also impact productivity across the enterprise. So I want to once again thank our webinar partner, SAP Concur, for their commitment to thought leadership, which we share as well. I encourage you to visit the SAP Concur website, as they have a lot of great thought leadership resources. And finally, to you, our audience, thank you so much for your valuable time. We sincerely appreciate the support of each and every one of you. Make the rest of your day great, everyone.